My girlfriend Lisa and I were at the spring dance the night it happened. I was into social events and networking, but she wasn't so much, even though she was generally a popular girl. We both had a few drinks and it all seemed fine as she went off to talk with some of her closer friends, and I got recruited into having some tequila slammers with the football team. After being there for an hour or so, Lisa found me and asked if I wanted to go outside and get some air, which was fine with me. We walked through the fire exit and out into the night air. Lisa cuddled into me and we decided to go for a quick stroll. It was slightly chilly, but not cold enough to present a problem. She said she was having a nice time but just needed a few minutes away from the noise and people. We made our way out of the school grounds and into the residential streets nearby, which soon turned into a large and very open recreational area. I would have said that it was becoming the most romantic part of the evening, but as we reached Pilliard's Park, we noticed that something was off straight away. There were people in the park, but they weren't sitting on the benches or using the skate ramps as they typically would on a Friday night. Instead, they were huddled together inside the climbing frames at the top of the slides, and a few were in the wooden forts made for the younger kids. They all looked terrified. I shouted out asking what they were doing, and a few of them shushed me and kept waving their arms. I just didn't get it, until I heard a metallic crash from behind. I saw something then which I will never forget. It was quite simply hell on earth. There must have been 100 employees of the Ballaway's chemical plant heading our way. I could tell by the uniforms, but they were not human anymore. I hate to say it, but they were dead. Dead but moving. I grabbed Lisa's hand and we ran into the nearest climbing frame. It was big and deep. You had to work hard to get to the middle, which was a space to hunker down and be silent, which is what we did. There were a couple of girls in there already, and they were beyond scared. I whispered into Lisa's ear and told her to be deadly silent. Her eyes were wide, but she nodded and gripped my hand tight. I indicated to the two girls to be silent. Ironically, they'd done the same thing to me only minutes before. The herd were coming our way, and we could hear their growling. I braced myself as the dead entered the park. We all got down on the wet ground and huddled. They sounded like animals, and I just prayed that they would bypass us and go through. The first one slowly walked past the climbing frame and didn't notice it at all. Then more came. One bumped into it and I swear that it made eye contact with me, but it just carried on, following the others. I thought we were all going to be fine, but that belief was shattered when I heard some commotion from out in the park and saw that a young guy had fallen out the tree he was in. He only had a few seconds before they got to him. I covered Lisa's ears and winced as he was ripped to pieces. More and more of the dead entered the park, but they truly seemed to not notice Lisa, me and the two girls, and I kept telling myself that it took some degree of intelligence to navigate through to where we were. It was a complex climbing frame and designed to be a challenge. They just kept coming and coming. There were so many, and I actually recognized one of them. He was the older brother of a friend of mine, and his name was Stephen Miller. But he wasn't Stephen anymore. He passed like all the others, and soon there were just dwindlers. Luckily, our plan was working and we stayed still and silent. We waited inside of that frame for an hour after the last of the dead had made their way through the park. By that time, I'd called the police and everyone I could think of. They all had the same reaction. They noted what I said, but asked if I'd been drinking, and I hated that I hadn't recorded any of what I'd seen. We'd heard police sirens in the distance, but we were all too scared to venture too far from where we were. Everyone was on their phones, quietly telling loved ones to get inside. I was thankful that we had survived, though, and that Lisa was safe. In time, we discovered that an employee of the Ballaway's chemical plant had been infected by some unknown pathogen, and it had quickly spread inside the building. In a panic, one of the supervisors had locked the infected inside, but there were enough of them to break through the shutter door. Unfortunately, in their zombified state, they were drawn to light and sound. Over half the people at the spring dance died that night. The fact that Lisa asked to go for a walk had saved our lives.
The night shift in our warehouse stretched from 8 p.m. till 6 in the morning. We all hated it, but the way the rota worked, most of us only had to do it once a week, so we didn't complain too much. Plus, the management usually bought us supper before they left, so there was a small bonus. The series of events that I'm about to tell you happened on a Friday night, and it started like any other shift. I'd been working with my supervisor, Dean, for the first few hours, loading panels of cedar onto pallets and trying to establish if we had a supplier issue, when the goods-in door opened at around 11 p.m. We couldn't see it as we were round the corner on the factory floor, but we all heard it, and that was not normal. We never had late deliveries, and all 5 of us were together and accounted for. We stopped what we were doing and listened to footsteps coming our way, coming closer. We were all surprised to see that it was an old man who had wandered into the building. He was shaking and looked terrified. Dean approached him and asked if he was okay. And I'll never forget this. The old man pointed in the direction he'd come from, and he shouted out that they were coming. Of course, we were taken back by this, and Dean said, was there anybody we could call for him? To which he replied that they were all gone. He never calmed down, but we did get his story after a while. The old man's name was Connor, and he'd been out at a restaurant with his family. On the way home, he said there were military vehicles at one end of the high street, and soldiers who looked like they were taking people's temperatures. Connor took a detour which led him not far away from here. As he turned the corner into the industrial zone, a crowd of people who didn't look like people anymore surrounded the car. They were banging on the windows and rocking the vehicle. Connor said that when he woke up, bloodied and bruised, his family were gone, the car windows smashed. He then got out his vehicle and came here, but he could hear them somewhere behind him. We all listened closely to his story, and I have to admit I bought it to a small degree. We had a guy called Mike on the shift. He was one of the packers and a bit of a prankster, so he decided to open the large shutter door. This thing was easily 20 feet high, and once you'd press the green button once, it would open all the way to the top, regardless if you pressed it accidentally or not. Well, we all stood there watching, and Connor shouted at us to close it, which we would, but it had to go up to come down again. When it had risen 5 feet in the air, I knew we'd made a dreadful mistake. For outside was an army of zombies. There was no mistaking it. They saw that the shutter door was rising and heard the noise it made, and they started to come our way. We shouted at Mike, and as soon as it hit the top, he pressed the down button, and that door grinded and seemed like it was descending in slow motion. Luckily, the undead moved slow, and it just to say closed as the first of them made it to the building. It was a scary thing to know that all there was between us and them was a shutter door, and you could see the impact as their bodies slammed into it. Dean kept saying that it would hold, and he quickly ran over and locked the bottom of the door to the concrete floor, but the more of those things that crashed into it, the weaker it became. We were walking backwards when the top right corner popped out of its groove. It only took another 30 seconds before it collapsed, and we ran for dear life. The zombie army were in the building, flooding through the factory floor, and they got to poor Connor right away. It was hard to tell at that point, but I think Mike was taken as well. As slow as they were, they still seemed to gain quick somehow. Luckily for us, there was a small ramp approaching, which bought Dean and I a few seconds to head to the back stairwell, closing every door behind us as we went. My heart was pounding as we got to those stairs, and making it to the top would mean relative safety, as there was a secure room up there which was used to store expensive metals. We made it as there was a crash from below, as the stairwell door came down, and we locked ourselves in the secure room good and tight. A few of the others were already there, which was a relief. The zombies made it up the stairs, but they couldn't get in. It was a narrow corridor outside, so their numbers didn't count for anything. We still barricaded the door and turned the lights off, then just sat in silence, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In time, they retreated, and we survived. We even had a military escort on our way to the hospital. We learned that it was actually an isolated incident, and we were told not to talk of it. But following that night, our world was changed forever.